The Moon Assembly Chamber held nearly 300 wolves, and every single one of them already knew. Vera Thorne realized this only when she stepped inside and felt the shift. That almost imperceptible change in the air that comes when a room full of people turns its collective attention towards someone who doesn't yet understand they are the subject of the story. Merchants whispered behind their hands. War captains studied the middle distance with exaggerated focus. Elder Haldrake, standing near the dais in his ceremonial robes, watched her entrance with the expression of a man watching a stone tumble toward the edge of a cliff. She had built half of what filled this room. The trade accords framed on the eastern wall. She had spent 4 months negotiating those, crossing enemy territory twice in wolf form to reach the northern settlements before the first snow closed the passes. The supply network that had kept the western villages fed through 3 consecutive hard winters. She had redesigned it from scratch after the Eastern War shattered the old routes, drawing new maps by candlelight while Alpha Thorin Veilcrest slept. The border peace that allowed tonight's assembly to happen at all. She had brokered it, alone, by sitting across a table from men who had tried to kill her twice before, and convincing them it was in their interest to stop. Vera Thorne was not the Alpha's shadow. She was the scaffolding holding up his ceiling. She found her position near the center of the floor as Thorin descended from the dais. He moved slowly, deliberately. The deliberateness was the thing that first made her pulse climb, because Thorin was not, by nature, a deliberate man. He was impulsive and charismatic, volcanic when angry, and magnetic when pleased, and the measured quality of his steps felt rehearsed, practiced, like a man who had walked this exact path in his mind many times before doing it with his body. Then she saw the small silver box in his hand, and the world narrowed. A Luna's bracelet, the symbol of Iron Moon's chosen mate. He had shown it to her 3 years ago beneath the moon cedars, turning it in his fingers while the stars came out, making a promise with his eyes before he made it with his mouth. "When the time is right," he had said, "when the politics settle." She had believed him. Not naively, she was not a naive woman, but with the particular faith of someone who has watched a man clearly and decided that despite his flaws, his core was honest. She had been wrong. Thorin walked past her. He didn't hesitate, didn't slow, didn't meet her eyes. He walked past her as though she were furniture, as though 7 years of her labor and her loyalty and her love existed in some other room entirely, and crossed the chamber to where Seralia Vossen stood waiting with a smile already arranged on her face. Seralia, the eldest daughter of the wealthiest trading family in the Northern Territories, beautiful in the way expensive things were beautiful, polished, curated, displayed. She had come to Ironmoon 6 months ago under the guise of a diplomatic visit and had apparently conducted a very different kind of diplomacy in the interim. Vera had spent the last several weeks quietly repairing the administrative chaos Seralia left in her wake. Ledgers improperly filed, correspondence unanswered, supply agreements mishandled. She had assumed incompetence. She now understood it had been strategy. If you wanted to make yourself indispensable, it helped to have someone else's messes waiting. The silver bracelet caught the torchlight as Thorin lifted it. The applause began before it was even fastened. That was when Vera understood the full geometry of her humiliation. The applause was instant because it was prepared. The smiles were ready because the decision had been made weeks ago, perhaps months. There had been meetings she hadn't been invited to, conversations behind closed doors, a consensus reached and a ceremony planned, and invitations sent to 300 wolves, and not one of them, not one, had thought to warn her. Or perhaps they had thought to and decided against it. Perhaps they had found the spectacle too useful to spoil. Seralia looked directly at her. The smile shifted into something triumphant, and she said, with the particular sweetness of a woman who knows exactly how sharp her words are. "You shouldn't look so surprised, Vera." A few people laughed. Not cruel laughter, worse than that. Amused laughter, the laughter of people watching someone else's misfortune from a comfortable distance. Thorin finally looked at her. What she found in his face was guilt, and the guilt broke something in her that cruelty would not have broken, because guilt meant he knew. He understood exactly what he was doing, and had calculated that doing it publicly was worth whatever it cost her. The guilt was not regret. It was an acknowledgement of a debt he had already decided not to pay. "Vera," he began. "Don't." The word left her before she could think it. It landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water, and the ripples silenced everything around her. Thorin's jaw tightened. He looked away first. She had always suspected he would when it came to it. Men who conducted their betrayals through cowardice never could hold eye contact at the end. She stood still for a long moment, listening to the applause continue, to Elder Haldrake's ceremonial voice announcing that Lady Soralia Vossen would assume oversight of all diplomatic affairs and territorial administration. Diplomatic affairs. She had negotiated every treaty on those walls. Territorial administration. She had personally rebuilt the Pax's trade infrastructure after a war. Her wolf didn't grieve. It took note. There was a distinction she understood then that she hadn't fully understood before. The difference between a wound that breaks you and a wound that clarifies you. She reached for the braided silver cord around her wrist, the one Thorin had tied there himself 3 years ago under the moon cedars, and she untied it with steady hands. Then she climbed the dais, crossed the floor in absolute silence, and placed the cord in Thorin's open palm. Not Soralia's. His. Let him carry the weight of what he'd chosen. "You should have had the courage to do this privately," she said. Her voice didn't shake. Thorin flinched. Not much, barely visible, but the entire room saw it, and the knowledge that they saw it was something she would keep. She walked out. The massive doors closed behind her, and only then, in the cold stone corridor with the sound of the assembly muffled to something distant and meaningless, did she allow herself to feel it. Not grief, exactly. Something older and colder. The specific grief of someone who realizes they were never fully seen by the person they saw most clearly. She gave herself until the end of that corridor to feel it. Then she stopped, straightened her spine, and began making plans. 3 days later, the message appeared on a body found in the forest east of the city walls. Captain Rill brought her to the scene himself, arriving at her door before dawn with his face arranged into the careful blankness that meant the situation was worse than he wanted to say. The body was that of a merchant, middle-aged, unremarkable, traveling alone on a route he used every month. The wound was efficient, professional. He had not suffered long. But carved into the bark of the tree above him, in letters precise enough to have been made with a blade rather than a claw, were 4 words. The dead remember. Vera crouched beside the inscription for a long time in the rain, reading it again and again while the forest dripped and Captain Rill stood at her shoulder in silence. She had been working case files for 2 days, burying herself in the administrative work that Soralia had already begun neglecting, using the familiar rhythm of investigation to crowd out the feelings she didn't have time for. In those 2 days, she had pulled 26 official murder reports from the last calendar year and laid them across her desk in chronological order, and she had noticed something that she could not yet name. A pattern of erasure, a recurring shape in who died and when, and how quickly the reports were filed and closed. This body didn't match any existing case file. She was certain of that before Rill confirmed it. "It's not a rogue," she said. "No." Someone wanted this found. Yes. She stood. The rain had soaked through her coat, and she didn't care. The carving is recent, made after death. Whoever did this wasn't in a hurry. She looked at Rill. They wanted us to stand here and think. They wanted us to ask who the dead are remembering. By the time they returned to the city, the rumors had already arrived ahead of them. Eric Dravenheart was alive. The exiled Wolf King had escaped his transport. The Butcher of Frostvale, the monster who had supposedly slaughtered his own people in a mad rage before being captured, tried, and condemned to permanent exile beyond the Northern Territories, had returned. The stories multiplied with every block she walked. He had killed 30 guards with his bare hands. He had torn a steel cage apart. His wolf was the size of a warhorse. At the city gates, which were crowded with twice the normal number of armed soldiers, she overheard a merchant's wife whisper to her neighbor that he ate the hearts of his enemies. Veyra had been an administrator and investigator for 7 years. She had learned to distrust the specific texture of stories that grew too vivid too quickly. Real events were messy and partial. Legends were clean. She filed the rumors beside the body in her mind and kept walking. The council chamber was already full when she arrived, every seat occupied, every face performing the appropriate emotion for a room that had just received terrible news. Thorin sat upon the Iron Moon throne with Soralia beside him, and Veyra sat down at the long table and felt nothing at the sight except a faint sense of wrongness, like spotting a piece of furniture in the wrong room. She had spent 7 years placing herself beside that throne. The absence of grief at seeing someone else there told her something important about how far she had already traveled from who she'd been 4 days ago. Elder Corvin Haldrake stood near the center table. He appeared composed, but Veyra watched his hands rather than his face, the way his right hand kept returning to the signet ring on his left, turning it in small rotations as though winding a clock. She had catalogued this particular habit over years of council meetings. Corvin only touched the ring when he was managing anxiety beneath a performance of calm. She stored the observation and said nothing. The meeting continued for 90 minutes of precisely the theater she expected. Military commanders wanted immediate mobilization. Merchants wanted the gates sealed. The nobility wanted reassurance that their properties were protected. Corvin spoke smoothly and often, and every time he spoke, he steered the conversation toward fear, the shape of it, the scale of it, in a way that consistently interrupted any move toward actual answers. She had watched him do this for years. Fear kept people obedient. An obedient room didn't ask hard questions. Then the messenger arrived. He burst through the chamber doors so suddenly that 3 guards drew weapons, and he stood in the entrance, breathing in ragged pulls, his face completely bloodless. "Alpha." A pause, a swallow. "Dravenheart has entered the city." The room went absolutely still. "He's in Market Square. He says he's waiting." Waiting. Not hiding. Not running. Waiting, as though he had arrived for an appointment. Veyra exchanged a glance with Rill across the table. He looked as unsettled as she felt, which was unusual enough to be significant. The crowd in Market Square parted long before the council party reached it, not because guards cleared the path, but because fear moved through the gathered wolves like a current, pulling people back from some invisible boundary around the man standing alone beside the central fountain. Veyra pushed through the last ring of bodies and stopped. She understood immediately why legends survived. He was not what she had expected. She had constructed an image from 7 years of story fragments, something monstrous, something theatrical, all violence and contempt. The man standing beside the fountain wore plain black, carried no visible weapons, wore no crown or royal insignia of any kind. He was not performing power, he simply possessed it, in the particular way of people who have survived things that would have destroyed everyone around them, carrying the evidence of those survivals in the set of his shoulders and the quality of his stillness and the scars that crossed his face with the pragmatic indifference of a map. His wolf was close. She could feel it from 20 feet away, a vast, cold presence pressed against the inside of his skin, old and patient and watching. Every instinct she owned told her to give ground. She stayed where she was. Then his eyes found her, and she felt the assessment in them like a physical thing, precise, unhurried, arriving at conclusions she couldn't intercept. Silver eyes. She'd heard about them. The stories said they were a curse, a mark of the madness that had supposedly driven him to destroy his own kingdom. Looking into them now, she found nothing that resembled madness. What she found instead was the look of a man who had spent 5 years being lied about and had developed a complete immunity to other people's assumptions. The recognition in his gaze irritated her. He knew her name. Somehow, before any introduction, he knew exactly who she was. The moment ended when Thorin arrived and the political theater resumed. "You shouldn't be here," Thorin said. Eric regarded him with the patience of someone who has already decided not to be offended by a lesser opponent. "I wasn't aware your territory extended to public roads." Several captains suppressed laughter. Veyra nearly joined them. What followed was not a confrontation so much as an unwrapping. Eric reached into his coat, every guard in the square drew a weapon, and produced an old leather ledger, weathered nearly to illegibility, and tossed it to Thorin. As the Alpha read, the confusion on his face moved through disbelief into something harder. Then, Eric turned his attention toward Veyra. "How many murder reports have crossed your desk this year?" The directness of it startled her. 26. 26 officially, he said. Try 42. The crowd erupted. Veyra barely heard it. She was already running the arithmetic in her mind. 42 bodies, 26 files, 16 people whose deaths had been dissolved into administrative silence. And suddenly every missing file, every altered report, every witness who had died before they could be formally questioned, began arranging itself into a shape she could finally see. Someone wasn't hiding murders. Someone was commissioning them. Eric watched the realization move across her face and gave her a single nod. Not triumphant, not satisfied. Almost sorrowful, as though he had hoped she might arrive somewhere different. Then he said, "You found the symbol." She looked at him sharply. "How do you know that?" "Because the same symbol marked the bodies in Frostvale." The square fell silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. "What symbol?" Thorin demanded. "A broken crown." Corvin went pale. Not the paleness of surprise, the paleness of a man who has just heard a secret he believed safely buried speak its own name in public. Veyra saw it. She held it in her mind like a stone, feeling its weight. A knife came out of the crowd. It happened fast enough that most of the assembled wolves missed it entirely, a flash of steel crossing 20 feet of air, aimed with the precision of professional training directly at Eric's throat. The Wolf King's hand moved. A blur, nothing more, and then the knife was between two fingers, held as casually as a pen, and Eric was looking into the crowd with an expression that stopped Veyra's breath. Not anger, not fear, but the cold certainty of a predator who has just identified exactly where the prey is hiding. The assassin ran. The crowd scattered. Corvin was already talking, voice raised, insisting this proved the Wolf King had staged the entire scene. Eric turned and handed the knife to Veyra. Not to Thorin, not to Rill. Her. She took it, examined the handle, and felt the blood leave her face, because carved into the wood, small enough to be invisible unless you were looking, was the same symbol she had found 3 mornings ago above a dead merchant in the rain. The broken crown. They met that night in the council chamber, and for the first time in Veyra's memory, the table held someone who genuinely frightened the elder members of Iron Moon's leadership. Eric sat across from her while the room argued around them, and she opened the old Frostvale ledger and began to read. The records described the fall of a kingdom. Officially, Frostvale had collapsed in civil war, rival factions, Eric's alleged brutality, a rebellion that destroyed everything. The ledger told something else entirely, a careful, methodical erasure. Supply chains sabotaged, healers removed from settlement rosters and replaced with individuals whose credentials didn't exist. Witness testimonies altered or disappeared. Death notices filed weeks before the deaths occurred, as though someone had been working from a schedule. And woven through it all, appearing and vanishing like a thread in dark fabric, the mark of a broken crown. Veyra looked up from the third page. "You've been investigating this for 5 years." Eric met her gaze across the table. Someone had to. The simplicity of it hit her harder than she anticipated, not the words themselves, but what lay beneath them. The solitude of it. 5 years of gathering evidence alone, with no authority, no resources, hunted across territories that had been told he was a monster, building a case that no legitimate court would hear. She looked at the scars on his hands where they rested on the table, and for the first time she saw them not as marks of violence, but as marks of work. "Why come here?" Thorin asked. He was watching Eric with the complicated expression of a man who wants to disbelieve something and is running out of reasons. "Because the killings accelerated." Eric didn't look at Thorin. He looked at the records spread between himself and Veyra, as though she was the only person in the room worth convincing. 4 murders 3 years ago, 9 last year, 14 already this year. Someone is finishing something. Closing a loop. He paused. "And because one name appeared again that I thought was gone forever." He placed a folded document on the table. Veyra opened it and stopped breathing. A name. A woman. A witness declared dead 4 years ago. She had seen the file herself, with coordinates attached, directions to a hidden settlement in the mountains. The document claimed she was alive. "A witness survived Frostvale," Eric said. His voice was steady, but she could hear the cost of keeping it that way. "She saw what happened. She has been hiding for 4 years. A pause. "For now." Corvin stood up so quickly his chair scraped back. "This is absurd." Too fast, too loud. His voice had lost its evenness, and Veyra turned to watch him with the focused attention of someone who has just seen a crack appear in a wall they've been studying for years. "We're making military decisions based on a criminal's fairy stories." "You haven't heard the witness speak yet," Veyra said. Corvin looked at her. "The woman is clearly—" "You haven't heard her speak," Veyra repeated quietly. "You already want her discredited." The room went very still. Corvin's eyes narrowed, and the expression behind them was something she filed immediately. Not the irritation of a powerful man being challenged, but the calculation of someone managing a threat. "We investigate," Veyra said, turning to Thorin. "If the witness is lying, we lose 2 days. If she's telling the truth, we solve 42 murders. The mathematics aren't complicated." After a moment, Thorin nodded. Corvin sat back down and said nothing more for the rest of the meeting. But his hand went to the signet ring again, and he didn't stop turning it until the chamber emptied. It was past midnight when the last council members departed, and Veyra found herself alone in the chamber with Eric, the fire burning low and the city quiet outside the tall windows. She had not intended to stay. She simply kept finding the next document that needed examination, and each time she looked up, he was still there,
reading by candlelight with the focused patience of someone accustomed to working through the dark hours alone. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. He looked up. There was something almost careful in the way he did it, as though he was used to people's expectations being a kind of weapon and was taking stock before proceeding. "Most people expect a monster. Most people were told to." A pause. The fire shifted. He held her gaze, and she felt the assessment again, that particular quality of being genuinely seen rather than catalogued, and held it back this time instead of looking away. "What did you expect, specifically?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about things. Someone who used his power as armor. Someone who had forgotten the difference between strength and cruelty because the distinction stopped mattering a long time ago. She looked at the ledger between them. Someone who had given up on the idea that truth was worth more than survival. Eric was quiet for a moment. In the candlelight, she could see the exhaustion he kept hidden during daylight. The years of it settled into the set of his face the way weather settled into stone. And instead? "I haven't decided yet," she said. But the honest answer was already forming somewhere underneath the words she said aloud. Instead, a man carrying too much for too long, surviving through sheer refusal to
stop, with a kind of stubborn integrity that had cost him everything and hadn't broken him yet. She didn't say it, but something in his expression suggested he heard it anyway. He looked down at the ledger. "You're Alpha, the old one, before Thorin. I knew his name from the early records. He was careful." He turned a page. "The current one isn't." "No," she agreed. "You were protecting him, compensating." It wasn't a question. She felt the irritation of being read accurately by someone who had known her for half a day. "I was protecting the pack." "That's not what the records suggest." He turned another page without looking up. "The records suggest you were protecting a man who had already decided not to protect himself." She should have pushed back. She opened her mouth to, and found she had nothing. Because the records, the 7 years of her labor mapped across supply chains and diplomatic agreements and rebuilt infrastructure, did tell that story. She had been extraordinary in service of someone ordinary, and some part of her had believed that if she worked hard enough, the gap between who he was and who he needed to be would close. It hadn't. It had only grown, and she had compensated for the growth without ever admitting it. Because admitting it would have meant admitting something about herself that was harder to face than his failures. "That's done now," she said. "I know." He looked up, not with pity. She would have ended the conversation immediately if she'd found pity. What she found instead was recognition. The recognition of someone who understood exactly what it meant to have poured yourself into something that didn't deserve it and had to keep moving anyway. "I burned 5 years trying to save something that was already gone. The difference is, I knew the moment it became ashes." His voice was matter-of-fact, not self-pitying, simply true. "You're still in the moment of knowing." She looked at him across the candlelight and felt something shift. Not dramatically, not the kind of shift that announces itself, but the particular, quiet shift of someone who has been standing alone for a long time and has just realized they are no longer standing alone. She didn't name it. She went back to the records, but she noticed it. The attack came 3 streets from the council hall. She had been thinking about Corvin's hands, the signet ring, the rotation, the anxiety disguised as authority, when the first shadow dropped from a rooftop, and the calculation was immediate. 6 of them, professional spacing, simultaneous deployment, her positioned as the primary target. She shifted before conscious thought completed itself, her wolf surging forward, and the first attacker died before he fully landed. The second she disarmed. The third nearly reached her throat. Then something came out of the dark above her with a speed that her eyes couldn't fully track, and the remaining 3 attackers became objects, things that hit walls and streets and lay still with the mechanical certainty of furniture being rearranged by someone who found the task neither difficult nor interesting. Eric stood in the street between her and the unconscious bodies, breathing evenly, not even winded. He looked down at the nearest attacker with the mild expression of someone completing a task they had expected to be assigned. "You attract trouble," he said. The absurdity of this, said by the man who had walked alone into an enemy city that had tried to have him executed, nearly made her laugh despite herself. "You were followed too." "True." He bent to examine the nearest body. "But they aimed for you first." She couldn't argue with that. She watched him move through the fallen assassins with the efficiency of someone conducting an inventory, checking for identification, examining equipment, reading wounds. He did it the same way he did everything, thoroughly, without performance, without any apparent interest in being watched doing it. Captain Rill arrived with reinforcements 4 minutes later. The surviving assassins were secured. One carried poison. One carried a professional-grade short blade with an unfamiliar smith's mark. The third carried a payment order, folded twice and sealed. Vera took it, broke the seal, read the first line. Her blood turned cold in her veins. The document bore the personal seal of Elder Corvin Haldrake. Authentic. She knew his seal as well as her own. Stamped, signed, authorized. A payment for a job she was now standing in the middle of. For a long moment, no one spoke. The city felt impossibly small, and suddenly much more dangerous. And somewhere inside it, an old man was sitting in a quiet room, turning a ring on his finger, realizing the walls were closing. The document hit the council table like a verdict. 3 elders examined it in succession, passing it hand to hand in a silence that had the quality of a room waiting for someone to say something that would make this untrue. No one managed it. The seal was real. The authorization code was real. The signature was real. Corvin sat at the far end of the table, and Vera watched him the way she had spent 7 years watching rooms, for the small things, the tells, the tiny moments where the performance slipped. He recovered quickly. She'd expected nothing less from a man who had spent decades managing threats. Within minutes, he had constructed an argument. Eric had manufactured the evidence. The timing was too convenient. The Wolf King had arrived, and suddenly all roads led to the one man capable of providing an alibi for every accusation. It was a good argument. Not convincing, but good. Good enough to create doubt, which was all he needed. Eric, characteristically, said nothing. He sat and watched Corvin speak with the expression of a man allowing someone to finish digging a hole. Then he produced the second document, a shipping manifest. 300 barrels of moonroot, routed through 3 separate transfer points to destinations that, on the surface, looked like normal medicinal supply chains. Vera read the second page and felt the room crystallize around her. Because moonroot in therapeutic quantities was harmless. 300 barrels was not therapeutic quantities. 300 barrels was enough to sedate thousands, enough to suppress resistance, alter behavior, ensure compliance in a population that didn't know it was being managed. This was how Frostvale fell, not through open rebellion, through slow poisoning, through a population made docile and confused enough that when the final collapse came, they couldn't organize to stop it. And the supply routes mapped in this manifest led not to Frostvale's past, but to Ironmoon's present. Corvin stood. "You're insane." The words came out too sharp, scraped across fear. He looked at Eric directly, and for the first time, Vera saw the history between them. Not political enmity, but personal history. The recognition of two men who had once occupied the same rooms and now occupied opposite sides of a reckoning. "I remember you," Eric said quietly. His voice had changed, quieter, colder, the controlled surface of very deep water. "You stood in Frostvale and testified against me. You told the neighboring packs I had lost control, that the kingdom was unstable, that the rebellion was my fault." He paused. 3 days later, my kingdom burned. The room had become very still. "You accused me of murdering my people," Eric continued. Not with rage. The absence of rage was the thing that made it worse. He spoke like someone reading from evidence, methodically, without the emotional release that would have made it bearable to hear. What you were actually doing was ensuring that no one would investigate the real cause while the evidence was still warm. Corvin's face had lost all composure. "Lies." 42 bodies, Vera said, quietly, just the facts. 16 missing case files, a shipping manifest for mass sedation routed through your personal supplier accounts, a payment order bearing your seal found on a professional assassin. She let that sit. Which part is the lie? The doors burst open before he could answer. A guard stumbled through them, bleeding, half-shifted, his eyes wide with a terror that moved past the professional and into the personal. He found Thorin, then Vera, then managed 3 words before losing consciousness on the chamber floor. "North Archive. Fire." The North Archive was the oldest records building in Ironmoon. 5 floors of case histories, witness testimonies, investigation reports stretching back 4 generations. By the time they reached it, the upper floors were fully engulfed, and the stone walls were running with reflected fire, and the crowd gathered at the perimeter had the stunned look of people watching something irreplaceable become ash. Vera understood immediately what was being destroyed. The archive was the memory of Ironmoon's investigations, official and unofficial, public and private. Everything she had discovered in the last 3 days had a corresponding origin in those files. Someone wasn't just covering tracks, they were erasing the ground entirely. She was cataloging the damage in her mind when Eric stopped moving. He stood at the edge of the crowd, looking up at the building with an expression she couldn't read, and then his gaze found something on the 3rd floor, eastern wing, 1 broken window, still dark, which meant the fire hadn't reached it yet, and meant something was still inside. He ran toward the building. Vera said, "Idiot," before she could stop herself. Rill glanced sideways at her. "You sound worried." "I sound realistic." The captain said nothing, mostly because he was smiling. She deeply resented that. Eric emerged from a 2nd-floor window 4 minutes later, carrying someone one-handed, which she catalogued as ridiculous on a physical level, before recognizing the person he'd rescued. Archivist Henrik, the oldest record-keeper in Ironmoon, one of the few wolves alive who held unrestricted access to historical investigation files. She was already moving. The old archivist's grip on her wrist was shockingly strong for a man who looked like he'd been assembled from dried bark. His eyes were wild, frightened, and absolutely certain. "The vault," he said. "Beneath the archive. The basement entrance. The maintenance building. Eastern wall. There's a secondary vault. Old royal records. They weren't supposed to survive." He coughed hard. "They survived." Then, "Don't trust the Luna." She felt the words land strangely, like a stone dropped in the wrong pool. Not Corvin, not Thorin. The Luna. Before she could ask him anything more, Henrik collapsed. His body was already moving toward unconsciousness, and she caught him and passed him to the healers who had materialized at her elbow.
And when she turned around, Eric was already looking toward the maintenance building with the same expression he'd had in the council chamber. Not triumph, not urgency exactly, but the steady forward motion of someone who has been waiting for this moment for 5 years and is finally allowing themselves to move. "We go in with 3 people or we don't go in at all," she said. "Agreed. And you don't run ahead." He looked at her. A pause. Something that might, in different circumstances, have become amusement. "Agreed." They took Rill. They left everyone else. The underground vault was a cathedral. That was the only word that fit. The scale of it, the solemn weight of it, the rows of shelves stretching into darkness, holding thousands of records that had been placed there by hands that understood their importance and had trusted the stone to keep them. Royal markings covered the walls. Crowns. Wolves. The architecture of a civilization's memory, buried to protect it. 4 mercenaries lay dead on the floor. Their wounds were precise, efficient, recent. Whoever had come ahead of them had not come for the records. They had come to ensure the records never left. And whoever had stopped them was still here. The footsteps emerged from between the shelves with the measured patience of someone who has already assessed the threat and decided it was manageable. The woman who appeared was tall, dark-haired, carrying herself with the specific economy of movement that belongs to people trained to guard things with their lives. She was scarred. She was armed. She stopped the moment she saw Eric. Her sword fell. It hit the stone floor with a sound that echoed through the entire vault. She said, barely above a whisper, "Your Majesty?" Eric had gone still. The complete, particular stillness of someone receiving news they had stopped believing could come. Vera watched something move through him, not the controlled, watchful presence he had maintained for every hour she'd known him, but something underneath it, something that had been waiting in the dark for 5 years without permission to exist. "You survived," he said. His voice sounded strange, almost fragile in a way that nothing else about him had been. The woman laughed and cried, and somehow did both at once. "So did you." Her name was Elsin Vero. She had been captain of the Queen's personal guard. She had spent 5 years in hiding, moving between safe houses in the mountains, gathering evidence in the only way available to a woman officially declared dead.
Slowly, carefully, trusting no one, waiting for something that might use what she'd found. "The Queen survived," she said. Eric's eyes closed for a fraction of a second. Vera saw the relief move through him like a physical force, and it hurt to watch. Not because it was painful to see, but because it was so nakedly human. This man, who had walked into enemy cities alone, who had caught knives with his bare hand, who had faced an entire room of hostile wolves without flinching, looked in that moment like someone who had been holding his breath for 5 years and had finally, cautiously, exhaled. "Where?" The question came out almost desperately. Elsin's expression changed. The relief gave way to something darker. "She escaped after Frostvale fell," Elsin said. "She went into hiding. I found her 2 years ago through a contact in the eastern settlements." A pause. "6 months ago, someone else found her too." The vault turned cold. "They took her," Elsin said. "I wasn't there. I came back to the safe house and she was gone. The only thing left was a payment record, dropped in the courtyard. Dropped deliberately, I think, to send a message." "To you?" Vera asked. "To anyone still looking?" Eric's jaw had tightened. The stillness was back, but different now, charged rather than controlled, the stillness of a decision being made in real time. "Who paid for it?" Elsin reached into her coat and produced the folded packet she had protected for months. Payment records, correspondence, transit documents, copied by hand in the moments she'd had access to originals before losing them again. She laid them on the table and Vera spread them open. She read the first page, then the third, then went back to the first. "The seal is Thorin's," she said slowly. Elsin nodded. "Yes." But something was wrong. She could feel it before she could name it. The particular cognitive dissonance of a document that was almost right, but not entirely. The way a forged signature carried the correct letters, but the wrong weight. She pulled a secondary page, held them side by side, and looked at the specific angles of the lettering where habit, rather than intention, made itself visible. "The signature isn't," she said. Rill looked over her shoulder. "Are you certain?" "I've been reading Thorin's correspondence for 7 years. His letters lean right. These lean left." She held the page up to the light. "Thorin didn't authorize this. Someone with access to his official seal authorized this." The room went silent, with the specific silence of people who have just watched a puzzle reorganize itself around a new center. Eric crossed the vault to stand beside her. He looked at both documents for exactly as long as it took him to confirm what she'd found, and then he turned to face the wall and she could see him thinking. Not the rapid surface thinking of panic, but the deep kind. The kind that reorganized 5 years of evidence around a single new fact. Then he said, very quietly, "There you are." Not to anyone in the room, to the absence in the evidence, the shape that had been hidden behind the shape of Thorin's seal, the puppeteer who had spent years standing behind someone more visible. Vera thought of Henrik's warning, "Don't trust the Luna," and then she thought of Seralia, the way her eyes had kept tracking toward Corvin throughout every council meeting, not with admiration, but with the vigilance of someone monitoring a threat. The way she had arrived at Ironmoon 6 months ago, exactly 6 months ago, the same window in which the Queen's hiding place had been discovered. The way she had never seemed genuinely invested in Thorin's affection, only in access to his seal, his offices, his administrative authority. Seralia had not come to Ironmoon for a man. She had come for a position, and someone had sent her. The bells began ringing above them. Emergency bells. Fast, insistent, the pattern that meant leadership crisis rather than attack. Vera looked at Eric. "He knows we're close." "Yes." "He's not running." "No." A pause. "He's making his move." The bells had been ringing for an hour by the time they emerged from the vault. The city had transformed in their absence. Ironmoon banners hung from buildings they hadn't been on before, emergency colors, and in the streets, wolves moved in the controlled frenzy that preceded formal proceedings, rather than the chaotic frenzy that preceded attacks. The soldier they intercepted, outside the maintenance building, was white-faced and specific. Alpha Thorin Veilcrest had been arrested. Elder Corvin Haldrake had filed formal charges of treason and sedition and fraud. The assembly hall had been convened, full emergency session, and the entire city had been invited to witness judgment. Vera stood in the street and understood the geometry of it completely. Corvin wasn't destroying evidence anymore. He was writing the ending of the story himself, framing Thorin for everything, using Thorin's authentic seal on documents Thorin had never signed as the proof, eliminating the man most likely to eventually turn on him in order to consolidate power before the vault evidence could surface. If Thorin went down for treason tonight, Corvin became the acting authority in Ironmoon. With that authority, he could bury every document they'd found, discredit every witness, and ensure the story of Eric Dravenheart's crimes remained the only story anyone could tell. He had spent 5 years being meticulous. Now, forced into the open, he was being fast. And fast, for a man like Corvin, meant removing every obstacle at once. Don't trust the Luna. Seralia is the weak point, Vera said. Eric looked at her. She's been Corvin's agent,
access to the Alpha's seal, proximity to pack leadership, positioned to manage information. But she's not the one who built this. She thought about the fear she had seen in Soralia's face when she monitored Corvin in council meetings. She's a tool that has started to realize what tools are for. She'll break, Rill said, if she has reason to believe Corvin will discard her when she's no longer useful. Vera thought about the Luna bracelet, the triumphant smile, and underneath both of them, the very specific fear that she had been misreading for days as guilt. I think she's already realized. She's been in that room with him long enough. They had 40 minutes before the assembly reached its verdict. They used all of them. The hall held thousands. Vera had never seen it so full. Every seat, every balcony, every standing position occupied, the crowd packed in until the walls seemed to breathe with them. Corvin stood at the center of the floor in full ceremonial robes, composure restored, looking precisely like a man who has spent 60 years preparing for a moment of decisive authority and has finally arrived at it. On his right, Soralia sat in a chair that had been placed with deliberate significance beside the Luna's traditional position, close enough to formalize her role without making it official, a staging choice that told Vera everything about how Corvin thought. On his left, Thorin knelt in chains. The sight of Thorin kneeling was strange, not satisfying, just strange, the sight of a man reduced to the size of his worst decisions, which were smaller than she had once believed him capable of. She had wasted time imagining him as larger than he was. She was finished with that particular waste. The doors exploded open. The impact was physical. The concussion of it moved through the crowd like a wave, and hundreds of wolves lurched to their feet, and in the sudden, terrified silence, Eric Dravenheart walked in. Not charged, not rushed. Walking. The particular pace of someone who has no doubt about their destination and no anxiety about arriving. The silence that followed was the most profound Vera had ever heard in a room with thousands of people in it, because the crowd recognized immediately what it was looking at. Not a criminal, not an exile, not the story they'd been told. Something older and more fundamental. A king who had been told he had no kingdom, moving as though the earth beneath his feet disagreed. Vera walked in beside him. Then Rill, then Elson, then Henrik, supported by 2 assistants, then 3 surviving witnesses and 6 soldiers carrying boxes of documents. She watched Corvin's face as the procession entered, watched the composure hold and hold and hold, and then, around the 5th or 6th box of documents, develop a hairline fracture behind the eyes. Eric looked at the elder for a long moment. Then he stepped aside and gestured toward Vera. The room didn't know what to do with that. She could feel the confusion of it. Everyone had expected the Wolf King to lead, to perform, to center himself. Instead, he simply moved aside, and the gesture was so apparently genuine that the crowd didn't understand it as a political choice. Which was
exactly what made it effective. Vera stepped forward and began speaking. She spoke for almost 2 hours. Not dramatically. She was not a dramatic speaker and had never needed to be. She spoke the way she investigated, methodically, precisely, with the relentlessness of someone who had spent years being told the room wasn't ready for the truth and has decided the room can manage. Murder records, cross-referenced, shipping manifests, annotated, payment orders, traced to origin accounts, the archive of forged documentation presented document by document, the testimony of Elson Vero, the Queen's own guard, delivered with the steady composure of a woman who had waited 5 years for this room. The crowd changed as she spoke. She could feel it, the skepticism giving way to uncertainty, the uncertainty to something harder. By the time she reached the payment order bearing Corvin's seal, the hall had the quality of stone. Then she said, "The signature on the document authorizing the Queen's capture is not Alpha Thorin's. It is a forgery, a professional forgery using his stolen seal. I will demonstrate." She laid both documents, the forged one and an authenticated sample of Thorin's correspondence, on the display table, walked the nearest commanders through the specific differences in letter form, pressure, angle of composition, watched their faces move from skeptical to certain. Then Henrik testified, then Elson, then the surviving assassins, who had been given reduced terms in exchange for complete disclosure and had apparently decided that Corvin's protection was worth less than they'd been told. Then the room waited, and Soraya stood up. She didn't look at Corvin when she rose. She looked at Vera with the expression of a woman who has finally identified the correct person to confess to, not for absolution, but because she is exhausted and the right person is standing in front of her. "I didn't know everything," she said. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she didn't try to fix it. "I was told I was facilitating trade agreements, intelligence gathering, diplomatic positioning." She stopped. "I knew the ledgers were being altered. I told myself it was normal. I told myself everyone in political rooms did it." Her hands were shaking. "I found out about the Queen 6 weeks ago. I found a document I wasn't supposed to see." She finally looked at Corvin. "He knows I found it." Corvin's eyes on her were flat and cold and completely certain. Soraya looked away from him immediately, as though the sight of that certainty confirmed something she had been trying not to know. "It was Corvin Haldrake," she said. "The supply routes, the witness killings, the Queen, the forged documents. He has controlled everything. The access to Thorin's seal. He provided it to me. I thought I was using it for routine authorizations. I didn't know." Her voice broke. "I didn't know what I was authorizing." Was all of it true? Vera didn't know. Some of it was convenient. Some of it was almost certainly partial truth, shaped to reduce Soraya's exposure. But enough of it was real, and the room had heard enough already. And when Soraya collapsed into her chair in sobs, the hall turned toward Corvin with the collective judgment of 3,000 wolves who had been afraid of the wrong thing for 5 years. Corvin looked around the room slowly. He took in the documents, the witnesses, Soraya, the soldiers, the crowd, Thorin's unchained hands. Someone had removed the chains at some point during the testimony, quietly, without announcement, and Eric, standing near the wall with his arms folded, watching with the patience of a man who has been waiting for this particular moment for 5 years and has no interest in rushing the last few seconds of it. Then Corvin smiled. It was a strange smile, the smile of a man who is processing defeat and has arrived, through some private calculation, at acceptance. He had built everything he'd built on the belief that the truth could be managed indefinitely, that memory could be erased, that power was self-sustaining. The smile said he recognized he had been wrong, and that the recognition had come too late, and that there was a kind of freedom in arriving at the end of a long deception. Then he shifted. The transformation exploded through the hall, bones cracking, fur rising, power flooding the space around him, and the crowd scattered backward, and guards surged, and
in the chaos, Corvin launched across the chamber floor toward Vera. Not Eric, not Thorin. Her. Because she had done this. She had been the one to find the pattern in 26 murder files on a quiet morning after her humiliation,
to pull the thread that unraveled everything, and Corvin, in his final lucid moment, understood that. He never reached her. Eric moved like a force of nature, no grace, no performance, simply physics applied with complete commitment, and the collision between them shook the floor. They crashed across the assembly, stone shattering, benches exploding, and Corvin fought with the desperation of a man who knows exactly what he's fighting and knows he cannot win, and fights anyway because there is nothing else left. Eric fought like winter, like the thing that comes for you eventually, regardless of what you've built to stop it. It lasted less than 2 minutes. When it ended, Corvin lay defeated on the assembly floor, and the hall roared, and Vera stood in the center of it all and felt the roar move through her chest like something being released. 5 years of murders, 42 bodies, a kingdom burned, a queen stolen, a king exiled into 5 years of hunting truth alone. Not anymore. Frostvale was restored over the following months. Its surviving territories were formally unified. Its people, scattered across mountain settlements and hidden villages, came home with the particular disbelief of exiles who had stopped believing home could exist again. The banners went up. The markets opened. The supply chains, Vera's particular contribution to the restoration effort, because old habits were hard to break and she could rebuild a trade network in her sleep, came back online with a speed that made the Restoration Council deeply grateful and mildly intimidated. Thorin Veilcrest returned to Ironmoon as its alpha. A diminished one, the conspiracy revelations had cost him significant political capital, and the knowledge that his seal had been stolen and used without his knowledge left him with the particular shame of a man who had been too comfortable with people he should have been watching. He was not corrupt. He was not a monster. He was a man who had substituted political convenience for careful judgment and had paid for it in ways that would take years to fully inventory. Ironmoon was his to lead, and Vera thought he might do it better now than he would have if everything had gone the way he'd planned. She did not bow back to him. She did not feel the pull of it. That chapter had closed with a cord of braided silver placed in an open palm, and she had no interest in reopening it. Seralia faced a formal inquiry. Some of her testimony held under examination, some of it did not. She emerged from the process neither fully vindicated nor fully condemned, a woman who had made choices she couldn't entirely disown, in a situation she hadn't entirely understood, and would spend years living in the uncomfortable space between those two facts. Vera found she could not hate her, which surprised her. Understanding people, she had discovered, had a way of making hatred impractical. On the first clear day after the winter solstice, Frostvale's restoration was formally declared complete, and thousands gathered beneath the open sky for the ceremony that marked the end of 5 years of erasure. Eric stood on the platform above the crowd, wearing the crown for the first time since his exile, not dramatically, not ceremonially, but simply, the way someone wears a thing they have carried for 5 years and have finally been allowed to put on properly. He looked out at the crowd, and something in his face was different from every previous public appearance she had attended. The guardedness was still there. She suspected it would be there for a long time, built into the architecture of him by years of survival. But underneath it, visible for the first time, was something that looked like the beginning of ease. Then his eyes found her, and stayed. The crowd was still talking, still celebrating, still roaring with the relief of people who have been given their future back, and Eric ignored all of it with a completeness that was almost funny. He descended from the platform and moved through the crowd without looking left or right, not stopping for nobles or commanders or dignitaries, and stopped in front of Vera Thorn. He offered her his wrist, the oldest gesture in Frostvale's royal
Tradition, not a command, not a gift, not a transaction. A question.
the acknowledgement of mutual choice, asked without assumptions about the answer. 5 years ago, he said, they took my kingdom. The crowd had gone quiet. She hadn't noticed it happening, but suddenly thousands of wolves were listening. 3 weeks ago, they gave me back a crown. He looked at her in the particular way he had looked at her that first night in the council chamber, across documents and candlelight, not performing, not managing, just looking. The way people look when they have finally found someone they don't need to edit themselves around. But a crown is not enough. She heard the breath leave several thousand people at once. I have found the only woman who stood beside truth when standing beside power would have been easier. The only woman who could look at evidence and see the shape of a lie that had fooled everyone else. The only woman who walked out of a room that was laughing at her expense and didn't give them the satisfaction of her tears, and then came back into that room 3 days later and dismantled everything they believed. A pause. The winter sky overhead was brilliant with cold light. You are not my subject, he said. You are not my reward. You are not my salvation. He held her gaze, and she saw in his eyes the same thing she had noticed across a candlelit table days ago. The recognition of two people who have each been alone long enough to understand its precise weight. You are my queen, if you want to be, because you want to be, for no other reason. The crowd became very loud. Vera barely heard it. She stood in the cold winter light and looked at the man in front of her, the man who had stepped aside in the assembly hall and given her the floor, who had handed her the assassin's knife rather than using it to consolidate his own position, who had spent 5 years alone in the dark, building a case out of nothing because the truth required it of him, who had looked at her across a table full of evidence and seen not a useful ally, but a person he wanted to be honest with. She thought about Thorin, who had always needed her competence, but had been frightened by it, who had mistaken what she gave him for something he was owed, who had stood in a hall of 300 wolves and fastened a bracelet around another woman's wrist and never once considered what it cost. She thought about the cord she had placed in his palm and the clarity that had come after. And then she took Eric's wrist, not from beneath it, not deferentially, not gratefully, not as someone receiving a gift. She took it beside him, equal, chosen, certain, and stepped forward until they stood side by side, exactly as they had stood beside each other every day for the past weeks, neither leading, neither following, simply moving in the same direction together. The valley erupted. Far back in the crowd, in the place where Iron Moon's delegation stood, Thorin Veilcrest watched in silence. He watched the way people watched things they had held carelessly and broken, and knew they would never hold again. Not with hatred, not with jealousy exactly, but with the specific, terrible clarity of someone who finally understands the full value of what he had, when all the evidence of that value is standing across a field beyond his reach. He didn't speak. Some regrets were too complete for words. And above them all, beneath banners that bore the twin crests of Iron Moon and Frostvale woven together, the story that had begun with a public humiliation and a braided silver cord reached its proper ending. Not the ending that had been designed for Vera by people who wanted her diminished, but the ending she had built herself, one piece of evidence at a time, in the particular darkness of a woman who had been told to accept less and had simply refused to. She was not a consolation. She was not a reward. She was not saved.
She was the queen, and she had chosen to be.